Antara, yeah, we are on live now. Antara, please start recording.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Yeah.
So recording is on, right?
Since you are the host, you can start the recording from more.
Okay. Yes, sir. Just a second. Sorry.
No problem. Yes, we are live and we have started the recording. Vicky sir, please start.
Okay. So good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this third session, actually, of the workshop on research methodology, jointly organized by Research Committee and IQAC of Ram Narayan Ruya College, Autonomous College, Mumbai. It's certainly a pleasure to be in a company with polymath like Professor Dr. Radhika Seshan. I can vouch the pleasure and the gratitude one can feel being a student from STPU. I know, and I have heard ma'am on several occasions. So, and yesterday we have done the formal introduction also. So today we are not.
Sir, your voice is not clear.
Yeah, hang on.
Hello, Vicky.
I think he's hung. He's frozen now. Just I'm some technical issue. We can ask Professor Radhika ma'am to begin.
Sure. As we have done the formal introduction yesterday, so I will request Radhika ma'am to start her presentation.
Ethics in research, yeah. Okay. Thank you. And as I said at the end of yesterday's talk, if there are any questions about yesterday's, then I'd be willing to take them on again today. But again, at the end, because I'll take both for today and for yesterday, if there are any others, I'll take them at the end of my session. Okay, so let me start with the sorry, there is part of a question that is there, but I'll answer all the questions later, okay, after I finish. Okay, so I will today talk of ethics in research. The first question to be asked is, what is ethics in research? In 2008, the University of Arizona, and they publish this semester, every semester they publish a newsletter for their incoming students. And the one of 2008 was, well, as many of the others, that's been put online recently. Okay. Now that newsletter was entirely devoted to the issue of ethics. What is ethics in research and why is it necessary? And that article began with the sentence, many of you may be wondering why you are being required to have training in research ethics. That's possibly a question that is in your minds as well. Because it's not something that we, why should we talk about research ethics? After all, we are researching in the social sciences. So why are we bothering about what is finally a philosophical or a social category like ethics? Now, the same newsletter went on to say that even if misconduct is rare, it can have a tremendous impact on research. Issues of ethics in research have become much more serious now. Not that people did not have issues about it earlier. But one of the advantages and in recent times, the disadvantages of a more connected world is that research of all kinds is much more open to the public gaze. So questions are now being more sharply asked about the quality of the research, and linked to the issue of quality is necessarily ethics. So whatever one does, who was it? The poet Alexander Pope, who said, "Man is not an island," modified that to say human beings are not islands. And whatever the human beings do are necessarily going to have an impact on others. And it is that aspect that makes it necessary, not just to talk about ethics in research, which a lot of people do, but it is necessary to both understand what is meant by that and then to apply it to one's own research. Okay. So, next question. Why would anyone commit misconduct in research? Why should you do something, finally something so silly? What is the point of it? Research is personal, as I said yesterday. Why should one bother with misconduct? Why should one bother with being, forget about the being found out and hauled up thing. Why would one take so much trouble over what is one's own research? You might as well do it properly. Unfortunately, that kind of an answer is not always the case again. Any number of answers, often the immediate answer is moral corruption, that this person is unethical and therefore is intrinsically geared towards being unethical in the way he or she practices. Other issues could be economic necessity. Still others, and possibly rarer, would be psychological disturbances. There are those as well. Any of these is possible. Whatever the cause, it is not a question of how many or how few there are. It is a fact that whatever happens, the entire reputation of the academic community is affected. You, as a researcher, are part of that community. And the same logic of one person at fault makes the entire class being looked at with suspicion applies to the academic community as a whole. One case of moral corruption, unethical research, is enough to make everybody question the validity of research itself. So it negates, in a sense, the entire research and the seriousness of the research that 99 others are doing. Therefore, we need to again talk about research. There are, of course, lots of theories about why somebody has engaged in professional misconduct. So that there is stress because of institutional pressures. That's the one that's most common. That the ways in which today's institutions are set up, and particularly the pressure on researchers to publish, these become the major reasons why people are in a hurry to complete research, and therefore they resort to rather unethical systems of getting their research done. Then the sooner you publish, or the sooner you prove that you have some amount published, the easier it often is to get grants. And not necessarily grants of the kind that we have in India of stipends for completing your research, but grants in the sense of attending conferences to present your findings, because there are travel grants. And if you have published, then the travel grant as a student becomes easier to get. But if you don't publish, people don't know that you exist in academics. Well, you need to get grants, and grants are almost invariably linked to publication, maybe in student journals, maybe in others, but they are linked to publication. And therefore, there is the pressure to publish. All of these are finally excuses. So which is why I've said the bottom line is that unethical behavior is a way of looking for shortcuts. And shortcuts might get you a certain way ahead, but they will not finally allow you to maybe have, well, at a personal level, somewhere if you ought to know that you have cheated to get where you are, at another level, sooner or later, people will begin to judge you on the basis of what you are and what you have done. And I think this is again something which was in a children's book that I read a very, very, very long time ago, which said that it's so much easier to be honest. You don't have to keep track of how many lies you've told. If one is looking for shortcut, surely that is the easiest shortcut. Don't bother lying. Be honest, you have to remember the lies and you might have to remember what lies you told different people. And in writing, whatever lies you have told are instantly identifiable. So if you're looking for a really good shortcut, I think the best possible shortcut is make sure you don't cheat in any way. And unethical research is a form of cheating. That said, let me get into the next part, which is again from the same newsletter, where it says that to the extent that research environment is an important factor in misconduct, a course in research ethics is likely to help people to get a better understanding of these stresses, to sensitize people to the various ethical concerns, and improve ethical judgment and decision making. May or may not. This is a factor that I would leave to your ethics. I will now go into what itself is ethics. Now, the term ethics has, as with so many of the words in the English language, it has its roots in Greek from ethos. Now, the word ethos itself has got multiple meanings now in English. So you talk of the ethos of the time, the character of the time, but it goes back finally to the original meaning, which means character. So ethos and ethics are therefore linked to the idea of character. Therefore, next, ethics in research is concerned necessarily with integrity, particularly moral integrity. As I said right at the beginning, ethics is usually understood as part of a normative system. So you talk of social ethics, you talk of business ethics, you talk of classroom ethics, but they're not normally seen as part of research, because normative systems exist in the world outside research. If ethics was part of research, then it would equally necessarily, be part of only those disciplines that studied ethics, such as philosophy. So initially, ethics was not particularly regarded as being of prime importance. It has become a lot more important in the 20th and the 21st century. And this is because of research that happened through mainly the 20th century, which in later times, in fact, very shortly after the research, in some cases when the research was going on, in some cases when the research findings were published, people began to question the basis of those research publications themselves. And they began to say that not that the research is inherently bad, but the methods of research have been very, very problematic. So ethics in research is both a methodological question, as well as a philosophical and an integrity-based question. There were two cases there were two cases and a series of questions raised around the first of those cases, which actually laid the groundwork for the entire process of establishing norms for research ethics. The first was the Tuskegee syphilis study, which was started in 1932, and then the Nuremberg Code of 1949. These two are usually seen as the basis of bringing ethics into research of all kinds. The Nuremberg Code is something that is a development of the entire Nuremberg trials that happened after World War II. At which time, the details and the very horrific details of the treatment of Jews in concentration camps, particularly the experiments that were carried out on Jewish prisoners in terms of things like brainwashing, electric shocks, and experiments of all kinds. We all know about all of those. The kind of horrific details that came out in the Nuremberg trials led to what we today call the Nuremberg Code. These two, 1932 and 1949, were followed by the Declaration of Helsinki in 1964. On the basis of the Nuremberg Code and the Declaration of Helsinki, it was declared that no research that involved human subjects, human beings in any fashion, should be carried out without what is called informed consent. That is, those who were participating in the research would have to be given full details of the reasons for the research, the hypotheses behind the research that was being carried out, the objectives of the research, and more important, once they were informed of all of this, written permission was to be taken from those who were the subjects of the research. So, informed consent. You first inform the subjects what it is that you are doing, and then get their approval, their agreement in writing, and only then are you permitted to continue. The reason for this was stated to be that research was part of the entire both epistemological and pedagogical process. That research is not just for your own sake to get credibility as a researcher. Research needs to produce knowledge. And this knowledge must be available to society as a whole, to humankind as a whole. And this knowledge has to be proved to be credible. It has to have a value to it. Otherwise, it does not stand. And value comes in only when it is judged. Knowledge is further used as a tool for teaching others. It is a pedagogical structure. So, from the points of view of both epistemology and pedagogy, it is necessary to have your own research rooted in a demonstrable ethical basis. Okay. Sorry. Because it is both epistemic and pedagogic, research of all kinds, not just that which involves living subjects, but any kind of research needs to be rooted in ethical norms. Let me give a few details about the Tuskegee study. It was begun in 1932. It was and focused on the city of Tuskegee in Alabama in the US. And it was supposed to be a study of untreated cases of syphilis. It started off looking at 400 males, African-American males, who had already been diagnosed with syphilis. The participants in the research were treated with a whole lot of medicines, a whole basket of medicines. In many cases, they were effectively treated as human guinea pigs on whom experimental medicines were tried out to see what happened. They were the subjects of medical research. They did not know what it was that was being had. They did not know what were the potential side effects, but they were being examined by the people participating in the research and the doctors just to see what will happen next. When certain medicines were seen as, after treatment, after being experimented with on some of the 400, then some medicines were seen as being more effective. And those medicines were never used on the same subjects again. They were now treated with a different bunch of medicines, because if this has been proved to have effect, then you cannot get rid of your subjects who might recover from syphilis and get away from the group. So they were given other medicines, some of which actually induced the disease once again. It is a total violation of any human norms. Later reports, particularly newspaper reports, suggested that many of the researchers had actually deliberately prevented both medication and knowledge of medication coming to the subjects. And the most shocking part of it was that this study carried on for so many years. It was formally closed only in 1972, when lots of newspaper reports came up about it. And it started off with actually one of the small town newspapers, with the Tuskegee newspaper, saying that, asking just one question: why is it that the findings of the research which started 40 years ago, why is it that they've still not been published? Have they been published somewhere? And that one question was picked up by a whole lot of newspapers, a whole lot of researchers. And finally, the United States Health Department got into the act and closed down the report. The study of the Health Department declared that it was ethically unjustified. The first time that the word ethic was used in this entire idea of research. So ethically unjustified. The problem was the damage had already been done. Okay. Somebody's mic is on. So could I please ask you to switch off the mic? In
Yes, ma'am, done.
Thank you. In a book published in 2001, which was named, I think, the Tuskegee case, and I don't remember the date, but it was called the Tuskegee case. The one section, this quotation is from page 49 of the book. The rationale was that the conditions existed naturally and that the men would not have been treated anyway, according to the premise that shaped the study, that African Americans, being promiscuous and lustful, would not seek or continue treatment. So underpinning the entire exercise was the racist attitude which said that these are subhuman. It does not matter what we do to them. So a denial of the humanity of an entire section of the population. And they took, like I said, they took 400 African-American males. They took them from only the poorest part of the city. They took only Blacks, only from the poorer parts of the city. And many of those who actually survived said that we believed that we were going to get better. We weren't told what medicines we were having. We were not told anything about it. We were only told, have it. And we believed the doctors because we had grown up in environments where we believed the doctors. This is unfortunately something that this still continues. Most of us just take the medicines the doctors give without really questioning what it is about. All of this becomes the first and the major case which brought in the issue of ethics. The Nuremberg Code came in partly in the background of and partly in association with the kinds of work that was happening here. So the Nuremberg Code said that all research participation is necessarily voluntary. Helsinki Declaration 1964 expanded on this and said that all biomedical research had to respect privacy. So, among other things, when you were taking consent from the participants, then you also had to get consent to release the names of the participants. If anybody said that the name should not be released, then it could not be included in the study. It was also made justiciable that if anybody, any kind of research happened without somebody being informed, and then there was a violation of that informed consent form, then the researcher could be prosecuted. So the entire issue of justice also started coming in. However, a problem that we in the social science face is that this entire structure of ethics in research was initially concerned only with medical, biomedical, and what we could broadly call science-based research. So then our question has to be, what of the social sciences? Now, this again, the questions about social science research again comes up from yet another research project. This that came up in 1963. A man called, if I remember right, Milgram, a psychologist who started this entire study in psychology, which was supposed to be a study of how and under what conditions humans obeyed or surrendered to authority figures. So a group of people was chosen, and various questions were asked of them. Then they were not permitted to see who was asking the question, which is again against the basis of research. They were not allowed to see the answers to the research. Then they moved, so that was the first stage. The second stage was when a certain set of so-called correct answers were declared to those who were participating. And then it was said that other participants would, well, actually, a set of questions and the correct answers were put in. And it was said that those who gave an incorrect answer, the others in the group were entitled to give them electric shocks. So for the wrong answers, these electric shocks were actually not shocks, but if you're conditioned to believe that you are getting a shock, then you were getting a shock. And some of the participants in that research got to the stage where, whether there was a wrong answer or not, they just gave the shock and the highest possible, the electrocution level. All of this was then calculated to see how long people resisted the authority, what kind of resistance, who identified resistance, and what was the attitude of the majority towards resistance. Did they join the resistance or did they become part of authority? And once becoming part of authority, how many enjoyed the power? So it became a study not of human conditions, but of power and politics of power. So how many became power-hungry authority figures? Now the entire research itself was an exercise in power hunger. Because what finally are you trying to prove over here? What made it even worse was that in 2002, I think, the same experiment was repeated with some minor changes in the protocol. And that was again accepted. And at that time, they discovered that something like 400 volts shocks were being given for no reason whatsoever, just because they enjoyed seeing what happened to the person after 400 volts of a shock. All of these become very, very serious issues in research. Now, based on all of these, in 2015, and this is again something that I would recommend all of you read, they have identified a whole lot of things which are essential to ethics in research, irrespective of whether this research is in the sciences or in the social sciences. The first is honesty. The second is objectivity. integrity, carefulness, openness, respect for intellectual property, confidentiality, responsibility, publication, responsible mentoring, respect for colleagues, social responsibility, non-discrimination, competency, legality, animal care, human subjects protection. Let me take each of these in order. Let's start with honesty. By honesty in research is meant that, at least in social science research, it means that you, first and most important, do not pass off somebody else's work as your own. You acknowledge that somebody has done, whoever that might be. As a teacher, you might find students who have come up with ideas that you have never thought of. Students, people do have ideas that you yourself, as a teacher, have never considered. It is your moral duty to acknowledge that student for having provided something. Then, objectivity, and objectivity here not applied outside you. And it's not like, it's not as though you are saying that the world is the object and I'm the great person. You have to look at yourself objectively. Is your research being true to the premises with which you have started? And the basic premise has to be integrity. How careful are you to make sure that you are not, well, to use a very, very open-ended terms, overstepping bounds? And those bounds have to be very clearly defined in your own mind, which is where carefulness comes in. Then openness. Research is not and cannot be a secret exercise. Because if it is a secret exercise, then you are somewhere indicating that you have something to hide. So how does it matter? And finally, whatever the perspective, whatever the topic, there can be 1 million people doing the same topic. Why are you so insecure in your own ability that you have to hide what you are doing? The fact that others have different ideas would only add to the richness of your own research, not detract from it. If it detracts, then go back, read some more. You need to be able to understand your own limitations. Ethics begins with the individual, not with society. Ethics is first an individual approach to yourself, and then it is an application to society. Then respect for intellectual property, which is not just that with maybe patent laws and other laws coming in, one is liable to be prosecuted if one is found out. It's not a case of having found out. It is a case of an inherent and intrinsic respect for property, which is both material and mental, so both tangible and intangible. Respect for property and as intellectual property. Then confidentiality. If you have been given a bit of information where you are told you can share the information and not the name, then you are required to maintain that. For example, many, many years ago, when we were doing some field work in a part of the coast, then we met a family and we were asking them about navigation techniques. And they told us, look, we have been smugglers. We know exactly how it can be done. As you are researchers, we'll tell you how it is to be done, but you aren't permitted to say who we are or which part of the coast we're in. They also said that we've stopped doing that now because we discovered that people who are against our country were following us around. So rather than give them the opportunity to attack us, we decided to give up. So anything that we do is legal. But we still know, and we are not going to tell you who we are because then we'll be the targets. Now, this was many years ago. I have used this example in class a number of times. But the name and the location is still not mentioned. So there is confidentiality, and that is my responsibility. Responsible publication as well. Now I can, again, if I were to use this example in writing, I would use it with all the confidentiality clauses. Or I would use it in such a way which would make it much more generalized. It cannot be used at all. I am responsible for what I publish. And therefore, I would have to be careful to make sure that what I am saying is not open to any kind of misrepresentation. Then responsible mentoring. This is something which is very important, particularly to the teachers amongst you. We all have students amongst us. We need to tell them how to be responsible, not just through verbal instructions, but also through practice. The old and often misquoted idea of the Guru Shishya Parampara is something which is inherent in responsible mentoring. If one is mentoring, what are we teaching our students? What is it that we want our students to do? So our behavior, our methods of action are necessarily part of that entire community of academics, which includes teachers, students, researchers. All of them have to be taken into account and kept in mind when one is mentoring. So, mentor with care. And respect for colleagues, again, as teachers. And colleagues over here is not just teachers, it's also students. Because in a classroom environment, as I said a little while ago, students would ask questions to which you don't have answers, or students would come up with questions that you have never thought of before. All of these become issues that have to be looked at. And if, for instance, in an informal discussion in a classroom or in the staff room, you have come up with a certain set of ideas, then the least you can do is thank the people who have given you those ideas. Or at another level, suppose you have been, as a student, you have shared your work amongst your colleagues, amongst your classmates, and have asked them to comment. You might ignore the majority of the comments, but there might be one or two which you incorporate in the work. At least put in a footnote saying that this is based on the discussion that I had with these people in my class. And at the beginning of a thesis, a general blanket thanking of all these are my friends who helped me is not enough. There are specific instances. And your integrity as a researcher is made much more manifest when you have the basic, well, this is courtesy as well, of thanking those who have helped you in specific instances. Social responsibility. The topic that you take on for research should be something where you do not hurt the sentiments of members of society. Your research is necessarily going to be part of a social awareness, if you like, at the broadest possible level. You do want your research to be read. Otherwise, there's no point doing the research, because the research is finally not for your own gratification. It is to answer questions. And if you're answering questions, it is part of, if not all of society, at least part of society. So be responsible to make sure that you are not using terminology which would hurt the sentiments of others. Quotations are a different matter, because when you are quoting from somebody else, you are locating that person within a particular context. Let me give you an example of this. I don't know how many of you read storybooks or have read as children, but one very, very popular children's author is Enid Blyton. Today, Enid Blyton is often castigated as racist, as having very racist attitudes, very colonial, very white supremacy kinds of attitudes. No question, they are there in her books. But her books were published between 1930s and late 1950s, when these were part and parcel of the entire social framework from which Enid Blyton came. To judge her on the basis of changed attitudes of the 21st century is unfair to an entire corpus of writing. On the other hand, to not discuss it is unfair to the audience who is reading it. So, read and recommend with care. Then, non-discrimination. We, as researchers, we should not use value judgments in our research. Words, so-and-so was a good king. Okay, how do you know he was good? What makes him good? So-and-so was a bad king. These are value judgments. So-and-so was a king who did this. Describe what he did. Describe what you think he ought to have done, but make it clear that you are judging him, and this is not a blanket judgment. So-and-so was a good person, so-and-so was a bad person. What makes him or her good or bad? You are judging, and you do not have the right to judge. So no value judgments. All of this demonstrates your integrity as a human being. And it is finally that which is most important to a researcher. The quality of research is also an indication of your integrity as a human being. Research itself might not be outstanding, because your research is an ongoing process. And if you go back to something that you have written, maybe, and I'm talking to the seniors over here, if you go back to something that you have written maybe 10 years ago, you wonder why on earth you have written it that way. Forget about 10 years ago. If you reread something that you have written in your first year of MA, in your second year of MA, you wonder why on earth you have written, because your ideas have constantly been evolving. But the fact is that you are not going to dismiss yourself. By the same logic, you cannot dismiss anybody else's work. You might say, you might not go back to reading it again. You might say that, okay, one time I've read it, and as somebody says, bas ho gaya, bahut ho gaya. You don't go back to it. That's your choice. But you are not entitled to ban it and to say, this is useless and nobody should read it. You do not have the right to make choices for others. You make your own choices. This is competency. Then the last three: legality, animal care, human subjects protection. These are aspects which take us back into the areas of medical, biomedical, psychological, and environmental research. This is something that I will not talk about at the moment, but we could take it as part of the discussion. Take the entire issue of cloning and the debate around cloning that is going on. Also, the entire debate on genetically modified vegetables and plants that have been coming up. We could take this up as part of the research, because there's a very major debate that looks at the ethics of genetically modifying certain elements. All of of this is part of ethics and research. In terms of the practical aspect, ethics in research is demonstrated through the issue of plagiarism. So I will go next into plagiarism. There are a great many online sites software packages that permit you to have checks on. I hope the thing has changed. Can you see the, somebody said that the PPT slide has not changed.
It's changed, ma'am.
Yeah, we can see, ma'am.
Okay, fine. There are a large number of, well, let us say, online tools which help you to understand, to map plagiarism. I've taken just one of them, which is the one which gives us the, which is the most used and the most well-known, which is why I have talked of Turnitin. But there are others. There's Urkund, there's Grammarly, there are any number of them. One thing to be remembered is that all of these are geared to work on the computer. And therefore, they are essentially looking at material that is somewhere accessible through the World Wide Web. Okay, so 10 types of plagiarism. The first is clone, submitting someone else's work word for word as your own. So you pick up somebody's work, preferably somebody who is fairly unknown, or maybe, as happened, I think, a few years ago, where somebody looked at a thesis which had been written early in the 1930s and reproduced it almost entirely as a new research in the 1980s. So this was a very, very little known bit of research. It existed, but somebody did it. So word for word was produced. That is cloning. The second is straight out of the computer controls, Control C. So you copy and you paste. So Control C, Control V. That you do Control C in order to copy sections, and you do Control V, copy it into your own. So significant portions of text copied from a single source without alteration. You just pick it up from one place and put it into another place. Like, and for instance, what are the quotations that I gave you from the newsletter? If I were to just copy it from the newsletter and put it into this PPT or my work as my own work and as my own statements, I would be doing Control C, Control V. Picked it up from there and put it in. Then next, again, comes in from computer terminology, Control F, Control H, find, replace. So you replace keywords and phrases, but you do not change the essential content of the content of the source. So for instance, instead of saying you replace the word as well as with in addition to. So, or as well as with also. You don't change the content. You change these a few phrases here and there. So you've replaced it. It does not look at first sight as though it's been copied, because some of the words, some of the phrases have been replaced. So indispensable changed with unchangeable maybe, or necessary, or something like that. Minor changes here and there. So some words are replaced, but the basic content that you have copied remains the same. Then remix. Paraphrases from multiple sources made to fit together. You have read, okay, I have in front of me a book by Robila Thapar and another by Aris Sharma. So you pick up bits and pieces from Rumula Thapar, and you pick up bits and pieces from R.S. Sharma and bits and pieces from others, and you put them together with suitable English. So you've put them all together, but without acknowledging that you have taken bits and pieces from these authors. Okay. So you remix. This is something that ought to be very familiar to you. We've got these remixes of the Hindi film songs. And I personally would say that the Hindi film remixes are pathetic and not to be compared with the original, because you add synthesizer music, or what was described to me by one of my students as six-seater music. So you have all the drums and all the cymbals and none of the rhythm and the lyricism of the earlier, but you remix and you make it popular. So it is what, again, one of my students said, jhang music. I had never heard the phrase before, but well, jhang music. That's a remix in a whole lot of ways. Then recycle. When you quote yourself, you look at what you have written and you reproduce that without referencing yourself. All right. Suppose, okay, I just will use my own work. It's the easiest way. I published one of my early articles in 1998, and I reproduce major sections of that in an article that I publish in, say, 2008, 10 years later. But I don't acknowledge myself. I don't say that this is from my own published work. I try to show in 2008 that what I am doing is original. It's original, but it was original in 1998, not today. So I have used my own work without saying that I finished this earlier. I am displaying a lack of integrity to my own work. If I'm doing that, then how can people be sure that I would not display the same lack of integrity to somebody else's work? Recycling, borrowing from the writer's previous work without citation. Hybrid, where you have perfectly cited paragraphs linked to paragraphs which do not have any citation but are still part of the same. So you copy extensively from one author, but to fulfill the norms of citation, you put a quotation mark for half of it and you put the rest of it in as your own language. This is actually something that I just do not understand. When looking at the language of a student, a teacher knows what has been copied and what that student is capable of in terms of language. There is such a marked difference, but anyways, some people seem to believe that, and it's not just students. It's a whole lot of people, and this is why peer reviewing of the work is necessary, whatever stage of your career you might be. Okay. Now, back to computer language 404 error. These are citations to non-existent sources or to inaccurate information about sources. Effectively, you've manufactured a source, you've created something, you've cited what seems to be a very, very interesting kind of text with that, but such a source does not exist. Now here there is a problem, because when one is using images, for instance, then there are times when certain images have been there at certain times, but are pulled down later. So when you go back to look for the same image, you don't find it again. And so what is thrown up is what is called a 404 error. It happens, which is why when looking at such sources, it is necessary for you to write accessed on so-and-so date. Somewhere in the black hole of the World Wide Web, this information exists, and somebody somewhere will probably be able to confirm that on the date that you accessed it, this material was visible on the web. It is not a totally non-existent source. So in order to avoid this, identify the date. And this is something that I would say to all of you. Today, all of us look at JSTOR. All of us look at the Internet Archive. JSTOR these days, when you download, it has a line at the bottom saying downloaded on so-and-so date. The same does not come in when one is copying images from the web. So for instance, when I do a fair amount of work with maps. So the source of the map and the date on which it is downloaded both have to be mentioned as part of your citations. Then aggregator, where you have done some excellent work in terms of very meticulously identifying what sources you have used, how you have used them. Sources are very, very meticulously and accurately given, but there is no originality in the work. So you have done a variation of the copy-paste with maybe a few thin threads linking the paragraphs together. So excellently put together work without one spark of originality in it. This is a what I don't know what is called these days, but back in my time, these used to be called kunjis, where you get to put together a whole lot of material that you use to study for an exam. Now that's aggregator. You've taken material from here, there, everywhere, and you give it to the students to reproduce in an examination. The poor student has no clue where this has come from, but the student gets good marks. And so those notes are used extensively without any further reference to who said it, when was it said, what is the context within which statements were made. None of this is questioned. This is aggregator. Okay. And then there is what is called retweet, where proper citations are used, where it is, but again, very little originality. So you've essentially extrapolated from a single source and followed that source very, very closely. So you have retweeted it. All of these are identified as forms of plagiarism. All of this constitutes violation of ethical and intellectual principles. With that, I come to the end of the presentation and I will go into question answer again. There were a few questions that were asked. Have there been any unethical studies in my field of economic history? So far as I know, no. I haven't come across any clear examples of that. So I would say, I hope this continues in economic history, that it continues. And I would hope that this is something that continues.
Ma'am, thank you so much for your very, very thought-provoking session. Dear participants, now is the time for all of us to raise our queries and doubts. So like yesterday, if you have any questions and any doubts, please drop them in the chat box, or you can also raise your hand and ask your question. So the floor is open for all of us. So go ahead and ask the questions.
What, no questions? Has this become, as I asked in one of my classes, too much of an overdose?
No, ma'am, that was a nice presentation.
There is one question
Yeah.
by Rohan.
Yeah. What can a
student do if he comes to know a colleague is making use of some sort of unethical practice?
Okay. First, I will say approach if you can. I mean, there are people who would not like to be accused of unethical practices. So approach the person and say that, look, are you sure that what you are doing is correct? Maybe have an informal talk. If that does not work, bring it to the notice of the supervisor with proof. It cannot be just that I believe and therefore it is true. You have instances of something like this happening and bring it to the notice of your supervisor. There is no other way. And at times like this, it is necessary to remember that if you do not bring it to the notice, you are colluding in unethical practices. So yes, you have to bring it. If possible, do it directly to the person who is engaging in it. Mostly that is not possible. So take it to a supervisor and give the instances. It's a difficult thing to do, I know.
Vasundhara has raised her hand. You can go ahead.
First of all, thank you, ma'am, for such a informative presentation. I have a question, ma'am, regarding the online places where we can check for the plagiarism. So, like, if I'm a student, most of the places where we can see the check the plagiarism are mostly paid work. So,
Yes.
yeah. So, can you just so, are there any places where we can see where are not paid or something?
I'm not sure if there is anything that is not paid. Plagiarism software that is not paid for. I came across one of these. There are free sites where you can upload a few pages and get those checked.
Yes.
But I personally don't really trust these too much because I think they are very, very, let us say, superficial kind of a check that happens. So as students, I know it is not always feasible to do it as a paid work, but if at all possible, then Turnitin or Grammarly. I'll just put the name in the chat box. Okay. Grammarly is something that I'm not sure if that is free. It's parts of Grammarly are definitely free. I'm not sure about all of it. So Grammarly is something which one can use.
And one more thing in line of this one, ma'am. Yes, I have used Grammarly also. They use, I think, they take some 1,000 words at a time, and then they do it.
Okay.
So one more thing that I wanted to ask.
You'd have to do it in sections.
Yeah, section. The the major problem there is, ma'am, if I do it on Grammarly and then I go for some another free website, so the percentage of plagiarism changes and it sometimes confuses so much. So can you just
see, the problem is the problem with using all of these sites is that once you have uploaded, your work will be matched against your own work on any other site. The first time that when this is it's a personal case, when the rule was introduced in Pune University about getting the students' work checked in the Turnitin. So I had my PhD student, I uploaded his work, and I got something which we're all familiar with, which said upload failed, cannot be done, and come back after some time. So I left it for the time being, and then I uploaded his work after 3 days, and it came back with 100% match because it had been matched against his own work, which had gone into the system. So I had to go through and I had to go to the computer system, get rid of his original work, and then get into the system again. And the poor fellow finally ended up with a 3% match. And those 3%, that 3% match was things like submitted to the Department of History, Savitribai, Phule, Pune University for the degree. That the basic acknowledgements and the contents page, which is standard for all, it was that which became the match. The content-wise, there was no, but the first thing was a 100% match. So these are problems that exist. And those are some of the things that one has to take into account. Yes, Vicky, they work on algorithms. And these are meant to match certain established structures. They are not meant to match the details, which is why up to 12%, and in certain cases, up to 20% is acceptable in most cases. So 12 to 20% match is normal. In the last time I looked at, I think it was Urkund, where it was, again, Pune University has Urkund, so the things are submitted to that. Urkund tends to go at match the, that, is as well. Okay, can you write sentences in English without at least one of these four, the, that, is? It's somewhere, at least, it's going to come at least 20 times in each chapter. So it shoots up straight out to 36% matching. And then the bibliography and the citations. When you are citing, then your citations are going to say they matched the IBID and the opposite, and they came to 40%. Because when we are looking at citations, the same as above is IBID. Refer to somewhere else as opposite. So Urkund matched the IBIDs and the opposites as well, and added to the plagiarism content. So these are problems that exist. Nevertheless, there is something which you, well, there, don't worry too much about what the software shows up as plagiarism, because if finally you have been careful in how you cite and what you are citing, the plagiarism content will automatically.
Okay, ma'am, there's a question in the chat box. Does unethical means or practice ban the research from publishing?
Unethical, yes. Sorry, this is Vicky Gaikwad's question. Stringent and utilitarian have contributed to increase. I'm not sure about utilitarian criteria, but I will say that many of the unethical practices, and even more what is called the predatory journals, where you get anything published on the payment of a certain sum, has increased because of the something that I have been grumbling about for a very long time, the academic performance index, where you are judged by how many papers you have published in a certain year, and your entire promotions are based on that. The quality of the journal is not taken into consideration, only the journals themselves. And particularly in my own area of economic history, I would be looking at material that is published from, say, in economic history is finally one of the earliest branches of history to develop as a distinct part of history. So I would be looking at material that has been published from 1960 onwards, and at the very least, probably earlier. I mean, there are articles that I have gone back to which are of the 1890s. And these are all issues that we do need to deal with. These, I think what we need to understand is that it isn't just how much plagiarism there is, as in how many citations have been used, how much has been quoted. We need to judge it on the basis of in what context has the quotation been used, Is the quotation extensive? We need to take a little care and go back to the original to see what kind of match is there. And most important, look at these quotations in the context of the originality of the overall research. That, I think, is where the mentoring comes in. So as mentors, it is our responsibility to make sure that the students' work matches certain standards that you have set for the presentation. In terms of, okay, this, Ms. Tiwari, this is a question because unfortunately, currently, there is no plagiarism check for any language in India other than English. And that becomes a very, very serious issue. Because there was a case some years ago where in one of the universities in Maharashtra, one chapter of a thesis was taken from the 1940s thesis, which was written in Marathi. It was translated into English and put in as that researcher's original work. It was found only when it went to a very senior examiner, external examiner, and that, Dipali, could you please switch off your, that senior researcher had read the original Marathi work and knew about it. So it looked familiar, so that senior researcher went back to the original and then rejected the new thesis. But this is a problem that we are facing. So Hindi, Marathi, Tamil, I know that they are developing some kind of a Tamil software to cross-check. Experiments are going on in, I think, Tamil University, Tanjore. I'm not sure how far it has gone at the moment.
Mehvish has raised a hand. Mehvish, you can go
Yes,
ahead.
ma'am, you mentioned about error 404 in research. So I've had that personal experience myself, like one of the research papers that I had done in 2016. Now none of the URLs are available. So in that case, what is the credibility of such a research? And the second question, if I may ask, is are there any legal regulations currently in India that govern these breaches that happen in the research domain?
First, about the 404 error, I would suggest that you contact a cyber forensic specialist to try and identify those sites. Because if it was 2016, there would be some record of it somewhere in the web. So you can contact somebody to say that, look, these are the dates on which I looked at it. And there are cyber forensics people who could do something like this at the moment. So I would suggest that that is the easiest way to try and get it. How effective that is, I don't know, because that's not a problem that I have had. However, like I said, I did learn from somebody that this has happened. So what I have done is taken down the date, which means that on this date it was available. And I can then say that I don't know if it is. I know that in one of the papers that I have published, an image that took a very long time to publish. So yes, the Wayback Machine, that is something, correct, Neha, I'd forgotten about the Wayback Machine. So yes, that is a possibility. But I do know that I had used an image for a paper that had been published. But by the time the publication actually came in, when I went back to check, that image was no longer available on the net. So I ended up removing the image altogether from my work rather than go into all the trouble of finding another thing. On another note, a much simpler way is, well, it's not simpler, but a much more, to use the term I've been using, ethical way, is to contact the original poster of that image and ask for permission. You would get, I mean, many of us, when we're using images, we are using images from various collections. So contact the collection and say, this was a picture, share a copy of the picture that you have got, ask them for permission to use it. If you say you are a student and you indicate what you are using it for, many of them would give it to you free of cost. If, however, you have a job in an academic institution, you are asked to pay for it. I don't see anything wrong with paying for it if you are given permission and formal permission, and this is written permission that is given to you to reproduce. For instance, the Pune archives, when you take photos of the Modi documents to use in your research, they ask you to give a formal letter asking you for permission to photograph it. And they give you a letter saying that this person has been given permission to reproduce a certain number, not crossing so many, a certain number of pictures of this collection in his or her research. That's given to you. So you get the permissions. That's one part. Sorry, Mahesh, I forgot the second question you had.
Yes, ma'am. It was about the regulations, if there are any, for dealing with breaches. Yeah.
At the moment, there are no formal legal regulations. They are more informal and more institutionalized. So at the moment, there are no legal measures in place in India. Except the Copyright Act, yes. The Copyright Act exists, and violations of the Copyright Act are punishable by law. That exists, but beyond that, there isn't. The Intellectual Property Rights Act has got certain things. I haven't gone through the act in detail. I know the copyright is included, and there is something about demonstrable copying or infringing of the rights of the original holder of the patent. But that seems to be more applicable to patents than to the printed word. So that's part of the copy. That's not part of the Copyright Act, but it is part of, I think, the Intellectual Property Act. Issues of that kind. Okay, the Scopus Index journals. I would say yes, definitely the Scopus Index journal hold a great deal more credibility than the journals in the new UGC care list. The UGC care list has unfortunately got in a whole lot of very, very predatory journals and has excluded those that used to be in the UGC list earlier. And something that I have not got into is the power and the politics of the constructions of knowledge, the institutional concerns of this knowledge. So the new UGC care list, some of the journals included in that are good, but many of them, and I know for a fact that some of those that are listed as international journals are by no stretch of imagination international. So the international languages are English, French, Spanish, to a far lesser extent, German. English by and far the largest. How in an international journal do you have the gall to claim that you have an international publication which is in Haribauli or Maithili or Marathi? If that Marathi publication has come in as part of that entire Society for Studies in Marathi Culture and Language, which is a formal registered body, which has a particular standing, which is recognized. If it has come out as part of those proceedings in Marathi, I can accept it, but not in random journals that come out. And I know I'm sounding very, very annoyed about it. This is something which has annoyed me considerably for quite a while.
Dr. Kalpana has asked a question. Plagiarism is problem. So how to write an article in order to get rid of?
Well, as we are social science researchers and we are history, we cannot totally avoid quoting from others. But you can get rid of plagiarism by most importantly, developing your own original arguments and using quotations very, very minimally in order to prove your point, rather than go into details of so-and-so said this, so-and-so said this, so-and-so said this, and not saying anything. You build up your own argument and say that this argument is based on the writings of so-and-so people. So, for example, okay, now, if I were to do a paper on historiography, then I would have to quote, because I am doing a survey of historiography. So I have to say, this is the concept. Okay, let me take the feudalism debate as one of the easiest examples. Okay. Now, in the feudalism, if I'm going to be writing a paper on the feudalism debate, I would have to start with Dange. I would have to go on to D.D. Kosambi. I would have to go on to R.S. Sharma, to B.N.S. Yadav, to M.G.S. Narayan, and to Yen Jha, all of them, as well as to D.C. Sarkar, Harbans Mukhya, B.D. Chattopadhyay. And I would have to quote from them because I am doing a historiographical survey of the work that they have done. I am not claiming that this is an original work of my own. I am only saying that this is the way they have written about the topic. If, on the other hand, I were putting a paper on, say, the application of the feudal model to my studies of the Coromandel Coast, then I have no business quoting all of them extensively. I would finally have to give only a paragraph by which the model is put forward and then look at the ways in which I am applying the model. So that would be my original contribution, where I am not looking at copying from what they have written, but I am saying that this is the model that they have put forward and this is the way I have applied it. That's what I would look at.
A question by Rohan in the chat box.
Okay.
What can a student or researcher do if they're required to cite or refer to a particular study, but its author is either recently deceased, at an age where he can communicate a valid answer, or is otherwise incapacitated?
In that case, you put it into a footnote saying, in personal conversations with this person on so-and-so date. So you indicate that, or you say that in personal conversations with this person just prior to his or her demise, and you put in the date. See, in history, we keep talking about dates, but the fact is that whatever your social science research, give the dates on which you have taken interviews. Note down the dates on which you have taken down information from books. In class, I say dates are meaningless. In research, I will say dates are required in the research notes. You cannot do justice. If nothing else, it tells you when you yourself looked at the work and when you would like to go back to it. So the date as an event is part of KBC variety trivia question. A date as a marker of your own research is definitely required in order to identify what you have done, who you have met, when you have met, and what are the findings from that day. So it is required.
Yes, Dr. Pradeep has raised his hand.
Yes.
Thank you, ma'am,
Yes.
for your excellent presentation and the issue of plagiarism and ethics in research. Recently, ma'am, there was an issue regarding the review of literature. It has been considered as a plagiarism. Okay, so how to tackle with that?
Easiest way in terms of the practical dimension is to give a subheading saying review of past literature. Okay. So review of literature, it unfortunately does often get, especially in Turnitin, it gets flagged as plagiarism. It isn't, because what you are doing is reviewing. But provide a subheading, because in the algorithms by which this is by which these plagiarism sites work, subheadings are often taken as a separate category, and therefore it becomes easier to market. I think that's the easiest way to handle it.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, I think we will take a last question. There is a question over here. Nowadays, lots of books are available on internet. And the question is, if we copied some information from those books, does it become plagiarism?
Not if you cite it.
Yeah.
Not if you say taken from the net on so-and-so date, taken from this site on so-and-so date, and say that this is based on, this is by so-and-so author in so-and-so book. So you cite it. Citation does not become plagiarism, because you are clearly indicating that you have taken the information from work that somebody else has. You're also giving, you're giving credit where credit is due and saying that this is where it has come from. So it's required.
Thank you, ma'am. I think if there are no more questions, then I think we can go ahead with the next part of the session. Dear participants, now is the time to express our gratitude to Dr. Radhika ma'am. And I have been assigned with this noble task of proposing the vote of thanks. So here I go. Respected Professor Dr. Radhika ma'am, on behalf of the management, the research committee, the organizers of Ruya College, and all the participants, I take this opportunity to thank and appreciate you for the very, very informative and resourceful presentations delivered by you for the last 2 days. I believe that every participant must have felt the privilege of attending your sessions. The first session that you took yesterday was on designing research problem and literature review. And the second session that you took today was on ethics in research. I must honestly acknowledge that your presentations were very down to earth. I think you covered everything pertaining to your topics in such a short time. To make your presentations easy and relatable, you also gave a lot of examples. You also clarified and answered all our questions very accurately and to the point. So thank you so much, ma'am, for giving us your valuable time and for sharing your expertise with us. I'm sure the knowledge shared by you during these last 2 days will definitely help each one of us in a very, very big way as we go ahead with our research work. And dear ma'am, we also wish you all the very best for all your ongoing endeavors in this field of research. So once again, thank you so much, ma'am, and God bless you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and pleasure to have been here with you. Thank you, Louisa, for inviting me.
Yeah, most welcome. Yeah. It was our pleasure. It was our pleasure. Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, ma'am.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you.
Pleasure.
Thank you, Vicky, for coordinating today's session.
Thank you, ma'am.
For handling the technical part. And thank you, Renaud, for ending the question answer session and proposing the vote of thanks today.
Thank you.
So,
thank you, sir.
Thank you, all the dear participants. We will meet tomorrow. Feedback link is posted on your chat box, so you can fill it. We will keep it open for the next 30 minutes.